Lurkers explores the dark side of the online world. It contains adult themes and disturbing content for mature audiences only.
It's a night in Cidade Tiradentes, Brazil. On the far east side of São Paulo, a car slows near a residential stretch of road. Closed gates, concrete walls, apartment windows glowing above the street. Inside the car is Felipe Afonso Araújo, 40 years old, an engineer, a man who thinks he's arriving for a date. He looks down at his phone and sends a short message in Portuguese. Já estou aqui. I am already here. 3 words. Not urgent, not worried, just ordinary. The kind of message you send when you pull up or someone told you to meet them. But tonight, something is different. The person he expects to meet isn't standing there. Or maybe not alone. There is movement near the car. A figure, then another. Something shifts. Felipe reacts. And then the sound cuts through the street. The car stops. When police arrive, Felipe is still inside. He doesn't make it home. What brought him there had looked ordinary. A profile, a message, a meeting point. But the last words left behind are not a warning, not a goodbye. Just 3 words that now feel unbearable. I'm already here. But in São Paulo, those words didn't mean arrival. They meant the trap had closed. In a world where connection is effortless, every click feels safe. But online, trust can be deceiving. This is Lurkers, true stories of trust, desire, and how technology, if unchecked, can turn it all against us. Hey friends, welcome back to Lurkers. If you've been with this show for a while, you know the kinds of stories we often follow. Teenagers pulled into private messages, women targeted through trust, obsession, or control, older adults drained through romance scams, people grieving, people lonely, people standing in a visible place of vulnerability. But today's case asks us to widen the lens a little, because adult men can be targeted too, not because they're weak, not because they're foolish, but because online deception adapts to the person it wants. And in this case, the opening wasn't always loneliness, age, or innocence. Sometimes it was privacy. I mean, think about it. The private side of dating, attraction, curiosity, the part of your life you may not want to explain to your family, your friends, your coworkers, or anyone. And this is the ugly side. When someone believes they would be too embarrassed to ask for help, that silence can become part of the trap. In São Paulo, the trap has a name: Golpe do Amor, the love scam. Some Brazilian outlets also call it Golpe de Tinder, the Tinder scam. But this is bigger than one app. It's a fake profile, a conversation, a meeting point, and then the screen stops being the danger. The danger is waiting in the street. One of the clearest ways to understand this is through a man interviewed by Brazilian news outlet Joel, who was identified only as George. And of course, this isn't his real name. Joel changed it to protect him. But George was 45, living in São Paulo, and in September of 2023, He started talking online to a woman who called herself Helen. She was younger, in her 20s, pretty, friendly, normal enough to feel safe, and George wasn't careless. He asked for a video call. At first, she resisted, then she agreed. And when the video connected, George saw more than a face. He saw family nearby, movement in the background, the kind of detail that makes a person feel real. So the account felt real. The woman felt real. The plan felt real. They arranged to meet, and George did the things people are told to do. He chose a public place, refused to pick her up at home, and share the address with a friend. In theory, that kept him in control of the plan. Smart precautions. But this trap was built to survive precautions. When George arrived at the meeting point in São Paulo's North Zone, the date wasn't waiting the way he expected. Almost immediately, two armed men approached him. And in that moment, the profile disappeared. The flirtation disappeared. The woman named Helen disappeared. What was left was a weapon, a car, and a man who knew exactly why he had come there. George was taken. For 2 days, he was held captive while people around him tried to pull money out of his life, piece by piece. Bank access, transfers, pressure, fear. The things a phone can open when it's no longer yours. By the time he was released, he had lost 20,000 Brazilian reais. One reason he got out when he did was because his brother managed to block his bank account. The money slowed, so the trap lost part of its purpose. That's what keeps George's story so unsettling. He didn't walk into this blindly. He tried to keep distance, keep control, keep someone else informed. And still, the trap closed. Which means this wasn't about one man missing every warning sign. It was about a method built to move around them. If this story already feels different from what you expected, share it with someone who dates online, someone newly single, someone careful, someone who thinks this could never happen to them. Not to make them suspicious of everyone. That is not what we're trying to do here. Or like to make sure they don't stay silent if something feels wrong. And if Lurkers is a show you care about, following or leaving a quick review helps these stories reach more people before the warning comes too late. George survived, but in São Paulo, not every man who arrived for a date came back alive. 1 month later, another man would leave home for what looked like a private meeting. A father of 2, recently separated, trying, maybe, to step into the next chapter of his life. And by the time investigators understood what happened to him, they weren't only looking at one fake profile, they were beginning to see a machine. His name was Eduardo Alexandre Deco, 50 years old, a businessman and insurance broker in São Paulo. And on September 19, 2023, he left home around 7:45 p.m. for what looked like a private meeting. The person he thought he was meeting used the profile name Jonas, and according to investigators, it had been created with a stolen image, a photo taken from a person in the United States with an open social media account, a borrowed face, used just long enough to make the invitation feel real. And the meeting point was Brasilândia in São Paulo's North Zone. What a coincidence. Eduardo drove out into the city, and maybe, for him, it felt ordinary. A message, a plan, a date he could explain later. But Jonas was not the beginning of a romance. Jonas was the bait. By around 8:20 p.m., Eduardo reached the meeting area, and that was when the date became something else. Armed men intercepted him. He was forced into the back of his own car. The vehicle that brought him there became the thing used to take him. From that point, the night belonged to the people around him. They assaulted him, threatened him, robbed him. Somewhere in that terrifying moment, Eduardo was pulled into the same truth Georgie had survived 1 month earlier. Who knows? Maybe someone connected to the profile was waiting, but not the person Eduardo imagined. What was waiting was a trap. And here's the difference with what happened with other men. Investigators would later reconstruct pieces of the night through surveillance footage. Eduardo leaving home, the supposed meeting location, the route taken afterward. They would also find scheme-related material on seized phones, more than 100 blocked numbers, multiple victim reports, and signs that Eduardo was not an isolated target. But it wasn't enough. Then came the attempt to erase him. Eduardo's car was found burned. His body was found inside. Reporting from the investigation said suspects were seen at a gas station buying gasoline and a lighter, items police believed were used to set the vehicle on fire. But, as you know by now, unless you haven't heard the Carrie Farver story, yeah, that episode is in the first season of the podcast. Check that episode. Fire doesn't erase everything. It didn't erase the cameras. It didn't erase the phones. It didn't erase accountability. 3 men were later convicted in connection with Eduardo's death. Together, their sentences totaled more than 94 years. The court also ordered damages to his successors. Because Eduardo was not only a victim in a case file, he was a father, and he left people behind. By the time the case reached sentencing, Eduardo's story wasn't just one fake date that turned violent anymore. It was part of a method. And before Eduardo, before Jonas, before the burned car in Brasilândia, another man had already driven into the same kind of trap. And his case gave São Paulo police another piece of the pattern. This method wasn't only taking money anymore, it was leaving bodies behind. His name was Mauricio Norberto Bastos. He was 52 years old, a pilot, and in February of 2022, he went to Jaguaré, in the west coast of São Paulo, to meet a woman he had been speaking with on Tinder. Mauricio arrived in his Mercedes-Benz, and like Eduardo after him, like Georgie after him, he probably thought he was arriving for one thing, a private moment that belonged to his phone, and no one else. But the street had already been chosen for one reason. According to UOL, Mauricio's car was boxed in by a Fiat Palio. He reacted, tried to get away, and then the trap turned violent. Shots were fired. Mauricio was hit. Reporting later said he managed to keep moving after the attack, reaching Avenida General MacArthur, one of their avenues, before the car crashed into a pole. He was taken to the hospital, but he did not survive. Later, police arrested a couple suspected of involvement in the case. Brazilian outlet R7 reported that investigators seized the Fiat Palio believed to have been used in the crime, and investigators also suspected that the same car was connected to at least 2 other kidnappings in the Jaguaré region. That changes how you hear the story, doesn't it? This was not only one man, one app, one violent encounter. It was a vehicle, a region, a setup, a method appearing again and again. UOL later spoke with Mauricio's brother-in-law, who did not want to be identified. He said it had been 2 years of so much pain for the family, and he preferred not to say more. But that already says a lot, because these cases don't end when the car is found or when an arrest is made. For the people left behind, the crime keeps returning in questions, in silence, and in the parts of the story they cannot bear to relive. But even when a family chooses silence, the crime still leaves a trail. Mauricio was killed in 2022, Eduardo in 2023, Felipe in 2026. Different men, different neighborhoods, different profiles, but the same basic movement, a screen, a promise, an arrival, and then the moment the person waiting is not the person imagined. By then, police were not only asking who pulled the trigger or who created a single profile, they were waiting to see the layers around the crime, the conversations, the ambush, and the money waiting on the other side. Because the deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became. The app was not the whole crime. It was only the doorway, and what waited behind that doorway was the system. In a traditional Roman scam, the lie can last months, sometimes years. Affection, crisis, money, apologies, another crisis, then more money. But in São Paulo's Golpe do Amor, the lie does not need to last that long. It only has to last until the victim arrives. It starts with a profile, a face, a name, a photo that looks real because often it is real, just stolen from someone else, sometimes from open social media accounts, sometimes from people in other countries who have no idea their image is being used as bait. The profile doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to feel normal enough to keep the conversation going. And according to UOL, the messages are not always obvious or aggressively sexual. Sometimes they are simple, daily, gentle, a good morning, a question about work, a few photos, just enough attention at the right moment. Then, the conversation moves somewhere more private, WhatsApp, direct messages, a space that feels personal. And once the conversation leaves the app, the trap has more room to work. Now there is a phone number, maybe voice notes, maybe a video call, maybe enough details to make the person feel comfortable before they ever meet. From there, the victim is not being flirted with. He is being studied. What does he drive? Where does he live? What kind of job does he have? Does he look like someone with access to money? Does he seem private, like someone who might be too embarrassed to ask for help? In other words, if he arrives, how much can be taken before the clock runs out? Then comes the meeting point. At first, it looks reasonable. A public place, a market, a street near a business, somewhere that does not immediately feel like danger. But then the plan shifts last minute. A change of address, a request to come closer, a reason to turn somewhere quieter. And suddenly, this isn't just a conversation anymore. The victim arrives expecting one person. Instead, armed men appear. Sometimes he is forced into his own car, sometimes into another vehicle, sometimes taken to a house, a room, a captivity site, what Brazilian reports call a cativeiro. And once he's inside, the romance part of the scam is over. Now the phone becomes the key. Pix transfers, bank apps, credit cards, loans, purchases, passwords, family contacts, anything the victim can access under pressure becomes part of the extraction. And the money does not always go straight to the person holding the weapon. Reports describe layers: people who receive money into accounts, people who lend accounts, people who move the funds. In Brazil, you'll often hear the term laranjas, fronts, or money mules used to place distance between the crime and the people directing it. That is why the word scam almost feels too small. This is digital deception, real-world ambush, and instant financial extraction, all moving together. Yeah, I mean, let's zoom out. A fake profile opens the door, a message pulls the victim closer, a meeting point places him where the group wants him, and the phone in his hand becomes a wallet, a map, and a pressure point all at once. Just to give you a better glimpse of how bad this became, according to UOL, São Paulo City had 51 kidnapping cases in 2023. 49 of them involved dating apps. 49 out of 51. And every one of those app-related cases involved male victims. That number is hard to ignore, isn't it? Because it shows this is not one crew getting lucky. It is a method common enough for police to recognize a setup almost as soon as they see it. And still, investigators believe some cases may never be reported because shame is part of the design. Yeah, sure, a victim may survive the kidnapping and still hesitate to say what happened. Embarrassed about the date, the app, being fooled, the fact that a private moment became a police report. And criminals? Understand that. They count on the silence after the crime as much as the secrecy before it. That is why this is not about adult men being careless. It is about privacy becoming isolation, and isolation is where these traps get stronger. By 2023, São Paulo authorities were no longer treating these as random robberies or isolated bad dates. The anti-kidnapping division was looking at crews, roles, bank accounts, fake profiles, and repeated meeting zones. So, the next question became, how do you stop something that begins as a message, turns into an ambush, and disappears through a bank transfer? For São Paulo police, the answer would not come from one arrest. It would come from attacking the system around the trap. To disrupt the Golpe do Amor, São Paulo police had to stop treating each case like one man, one app, one bad night. If the crime worked like a system, the response had to move like one too. According to Agência SP, São Paulo's anti-kidnapping division began targeting the structure around these crimes. They weren't only going after the people holding victims, they were also looking at the leaders, the account handlers, and the money mules. And police coordinated with banks, app companies, prosecutors, and intelligence teams. The numbers changed. In the first half of 2022, São Paulo recorded 58 cases connected to this kind of scheme. In the first half of 2023, 25. And in the first half of 2024, 2. Authorities said part of the strategy was speed. In these cases, time is everything. The faster police can identify a profile, a phone number, a bank account, a transfer, or a possible holding location, the better chance they have of finding the victim alive. And the urgency also reached the platforms. After pressure from São Paulo's police prosecutor's office, starting in July of 2023, Match Group, Tinder's parent company, agreed to create a Portuguese-language 24-hour channel for police, prosecutors, and judges in Brazil, so lawful requests connected to ongoing crimes could move faster. That detail shows the scale of the problem. This was not only a police issue, not only a dating app issue, not only a banking issue. It sat between all of them. But even with arrests, coordination, and the sharp drop in reported cases, the danger did not vanish. A method can shrink and still survive. And that brings us back to Felipe, the engineer in Cidade Tiradentes, the man who sent an ordinary message before the night changed around him. Já estou aqui. I'm already here. His father later said Felipe had used dating apps before, but usually chose public, busy places. That stays with me, because it tells us Felipe was not unaware. He was not the careless version of a victim people invent after the fact. He was a grown man who thought he understood the risk, until the risk arrived differently. And that is the warning behind this episode. Not that every app is dangerous. Not that every person online is lying. Not that dating itself should become something to fear. The warning is that privacy should never become isolation. If a new date changes locations at the last minute, stop. If someone pressures you to come alone, stop. If the conversation moves fast and then suddenly becomes urgent, stop. And if something feels wrong, call someone before you try to solve it alone. Not after. Before. Because shame is useful to criminals. Silence is useful to criminals. And the belief that, quote-unquote, this could never happen to me, is useful to criminals. Eduardo thought he was going to meet someone. Mauricio thought he was going to meet someone. Jorge did the things people are told to do and still found himself inside the trap. Felipe sent 3 words that should have meant nothing more than an arrival. But in this system, arrival was the vulnerable moment. The profile did not need to be perfect. The lie did not need to last forever. It only had to last long enough for someone to show up alone. My friends, I hope this episode stayed with you. And if it did, follow Lurkers wherever you're listening. And if your app lets you leave a review, that helps more than you know. It helps these stories reach people who may never reach for them, but may need the warning all the same. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, send this episode to them. Not to make their day darker or to overwhelm them, just to give them something they might remember at the right moment. Remember Felipe Afonso Araújo. Remember Eduardo Alexandre Decaux. Remember Mauricio Noberto Bastos. And remember the men who survived, but may never want their names spoken. Stay aware. Stay present. Stay safe. This episode of Lurkers was written and hosted by me, Frank Battiston. Production and sound design by Daniel Erdenevia. Thanks for listening.